As a lot of OG viewers of this channel know, I really love creating and replicating anime things in 3D software. So today we're going to learn how to make anime styled rocks using Substance Painter, a procedural software, meaning we're not going to hand paint anything at all. And all of these project files are going to be available completely free, so I will leave a link in the description. The first thing that is really important to establish is your color base, at least for my workflow. So I like to set a base color first, and then the next 3 layers are going to be 3 different layers of color variations slapped on top. So we're going to go through those first. So to create your base layer, create a new fill layer and name it base layer. Then we're going to only keep the color channel and roughness channel turned on. You can isolate channels by pressing Control-click. So for the color, I choose a nice, cool blue. I don't really like using grays, blacks, and whites in stylized art. It's pretty boring. And then we're going to establish our roughness layer right at the beginning. So for stylized materials like rocks, I like to keep the roughness value at around anywhere from 0.6 to 0.8 is a really, really good value. Okay, now that we've got a decent color for the base layer, we're going to be creating 3 separate layers for color variation. Each one is going to follow the same process, but I'm going to be using different grunge maps and slightly different colors to get different results. When you combine and layer these together, you get a really, really cool color texture that I use for a lot of my stylized designs. Okay, so let's create a new layer and name it whatever you want. I like to call these color var 1, 2, 3, etc. We're then also going to make sure that we only isolate the color channel because we want the roughness value that we created in the base layer to be passed through into this layer. Now we're going to right click and create a black mask, and then right click again and add fill. This new fill layer allows us to mask in a grunge texture and then add filters to it to create a stylized pattern design. I'm going to use grunge paint streak circular for this example, but you can use whatever you want after you get used to the workflow. Here's one of my most favorite tricks in Substance Painter. You can right click, add a filter, and then add a blur slope. It just adds a really cool painterly look and stylizes the texture that you're trying to work with. Once the basic setup is ready, you can start tweaking the color and you can start tweaking some of the values like the opacity and even the size of the texture to get the look that you want. I end up with choosing a darker look here, and I'm going to contrast that with some lighter colors in my next 2 layers. This is the really powerful thing about procedural materials and creating things non-destructively. I'm going back to my base layer now to tweak the colors a little bit so that the base layer complements the next color layer a little better. Okay, so let's do the second color variation. So same thing, let's add a fill layer. Let's name it color var 2. And then we're going to right click on the layer, create a black mask, and we're going to right click one more time and create another fill layer, and we're going to pop in another grunge texture with a blur filter on top of it. For this layer, I'm going to have a nice contrast light blue. I think it's going to contrast really well with the 2 color layers that we have so far. I love using this grunge map 4 because when you add a paint filter to it, the blotchiness really mimics paint strokes really well after the blur filter is applied. Also, you may notice that there's no lighting on this material right now. That's because I'm only working in the base color channel. You could see in the right-hand corner, I only have the base color channel selected. You can change that by pressing C in Substance Painter. Once I drop the opacity down a bit, you can really see how the blur filter is really mimicking paint strokes very well. Okay, so it's time for color variation layer number 3. At this point, I think you get the hang of it. We're going to create a new layer named color var 3. We're going to right click it again, add a black mask, and right click one more time and add a fill layer. Don't forget to turn off all the channels except for color. Now in this layer, I noticed that the base layer is still looking a little boring, so I added a really noisy texture this time to really break up the colors and add a ton of texture. And look at that, such a great result already. So here's another good trick you can use. On top of changing the color, adding a blur slope filter. You can also change the UV tiling in the actual grunge map itself to create a ton of variation, including the rotation and the offset. So technically, using a single grunge texture, you could create an entire stylized rock like this as well. Might be a good idea for another video. So if you need more detail, you can make the UV smaller so there's more detail packed in, and if you want it a little more blurry, you can increase the tiling. And now that we've done that, we've got a nice cloudy layer that has a lot of softer details, which contrasts really nicely with the sharper, blurry strokes. And as you're going through this tutorial, I always recommend pausing it and tweaking everything to get your own unique look. I'm constantly doing this throughout my workflow, so nothing really ever ends up looking exactly how I want it, but everything ends up being unique and my own. Originally on this layer, I was going to add more blue, but I found that adding a little bit of green tinge to it breaks up the color a little more and ends up looking even better. Now, after you've created about 3 layers, it can get a little difficult to see exactly where your grunge map is affecting. So if you press C to cycle through the colors, you can select the mask layer, which allows you to see exactly where your colors are being affected. The white is where your color is going to be, and black is where there's going to be no color whatsoever. So I'd always recommend using that as well. After you're happy with all of your color variation layers, just add a folder, name it whatever you want, and then shift click and drag all of the color variation layers into the folder. There, nice and organized. While I was going through my reference images, I noticed that a lot of these anime rocks had really cool looking white spots and splotches on them. So I thought, let's push this even further and see what we can come up with. So let's create a new fill layer. Again, add a black mask, and we're gonna add another grunge fill layer as well. One should be pretty easy. I know there's a grunge map called grunge spots. So we're going to be using that. By manipulating the UV tiling again, I can get it to a size that I think is going to be appropriate for this rock. Now I got it to a spot where I really like it, but there was just a few too many spots, so I pull back on the balance setting a little bit. So I wanted to try and use a warp filter just to see if it would look a little different, just to use a different filter. But honestly, I didn't really like the look of it, so I decided to remain consistent and just apply a simple blur slope filter to it again. It's just so good at mimicking paint strokes. It's so hard to not use it. Okay, yeah, that looks pretty good to me. I'm really glad I consulted my references on this one because this is a little detail that I would have missed if I wasn't using references. So I'm pretty happy with this look. Let's move on to the next layer. In normal circumstances, we would use a normal map to add the cracks and crevices of a rock without having to really texture it. And then we'd use our mesh maps to create detail and fake edge wear. But this is stylized stations, so I wanted to find if there was a way to use these grunge maps that we've been using to fake rock detail. And I think I found a really great way to do it. So I think you guys are getting the hang of this by now. We're going to create a new fill layer. We're going to name it creases or whatever you want to name it. We're going to right click and add a black mask. And then we're going to right click one more time and we're going to add another fill layer. So to create these creases and cracks, I was really banging my head against the wall for a while. But then I started thinking about cloth and how cloth textures have really nice folds and creases in them. And I found this cloth fold large texture. And this texture had a ton of really great details in it that I found really mimicked rock texture very, very well. So by messing with the UV tiling, I got it to a nice size that I wanted, and then used the multiply blend mode to make sure that it's a lot darker than all the other colors. And even like that, it looks like rocks. It looks like rock crack. I was really, really happy with this result. And by adding a blur slope filter, it pushes that stylized design even further. So do yourself a favor, grab this texture, put it on your material, and then mess around with the settings. This is a looser tutorial, so you don't have to do it exactly like mine. I just want you to understand the concepts. I found that it was a little too strong at 100% opacity, so I brought it down to 80%, and that looks pretty good to me. So a really important aspect of stylized design is adding a gradient, a top-down gradient specifically. So for this layer, it's gonna be a little different. Let's create a new layer. We're gonna add a black mask like before, but this time we're gonna right click and add a generator. And we're gonna be using the mask editor for this, although you could use the position generator as well. Right now, the position generator is only picking up on the curvature opacity, so we're gonna turn that all the way down to 0, and we're gonna go to the position gradient and use the drop-down menu to tweak the balance, contrast, and brightness. You can also press the invert setting there to flip the mask upside down like I do here. So by pulling the balance, I really only want the color, the white part, to affect the very, very bottom of the mesh. If you're creating rocks that are going to be in your environment and rotated around, you don't really want to create the gradient in Substance Painter. You'd want to create a world position gradient in your engines, like Unreal Engine, in the actual shader itself. So let's set the blend mode to multiply, and we're going to choose a color that contrasts the rest of the color that we've been using so far. We've been using deeper, cool tones like blues and grays and kind of lighter greens, so let's use a darker brownish yellow. Everything's not going to look perfect right away, especially if you're using a different rock mesh than I'm using, so don't forget to go into the color settings and change everything around, including the balance and contrast of the world position settings in the mask generator. As I cycle through the colors, I'm really just looking at all of the different options and how they could potentially look, but I like the yellowish brown because that's what rocks look like when they're in dirt. They've got a little bit of brown and dirt on them. So even though this is stylized design, it's important to make sure that it's at least somewhat rooted in realism, or else people have no idea what they're looking at. I love using gradients because they're very powerful for a few ways. They really help with color variation and breaking up simple textures, but they can also be used to direct your eye to focal points. One of the really great things about procedural generation with textures is that instead of having to manually go in and hand paint edgeware on all of these rocks, you can just create a generator like the position generator we created before and make sure that it selects only the sharper edges of the rock. In this rock that I'm using right now, it's kind of curvy and doesn't have sharper edges, but I really want you guys to use this in your designs as well, especially when you're creating rocks and cliffs that have sharper edges. So let's go ahead and do this layer anyway, just to show you what it would look like. Let's create a brand new fill layer, and we're going to name it curvature or edges, whatever. We're going to right click again and add a black mask, and this time we're going to right click one more time and add a mask generator. Since the curvature opacity is already turned up to about 50%, we're just going to go over to that section and use the drop-down menu and mess with all of these settings down here. This is one of my favorite parts. You can tweak the different sizes of the curvature so that the mask picks up on different parts of it, and you can completely customize it to however you want. Since I've sculpted the high poly, I've got a lot of really small micro details in there, and by pulling on the larger settings, I can create really, really interesting textures. Now, this is really dependent on the high poly or the sculpt of your rock. So if you have sharper edges or if you're using a different shaped rock, these are going to look completely different. But the great part about these generators is that they are going to dynamically adjust to every single rock that you bring in there. So as long as everything is nice and baked, you're going to get really unique and different results every time. And since it's procedural, you can go back and tweak them and change them if you don't like the way it looks. So you're going to be able to create designs very quickly and also change them very rapidly as well. It's super, super powerful stuff. So once you've applied this generator, all it really is making sure that you tweak these layers to how you see fit, and then make sure you're setting a nice color. Since it's technically mimicking edgeware, I will use a lighter color for this, but again, you can use this for whatever you want. After a lot of tweaking, I finally get it to a spot where I am really happy with it. I think the final result and the real X factor of this comes from when I upped the contrast, which made the curvature and all the textures and materials pop quite a bit. So for the final layer of polish, we're gonna be using a really powerful filter that I use to finish all of my materials, called a baked lighting filter. This one's gonna be a little different, so create a fill layer like normal, but you're not creating a black mask this time. Just change the blend mode straight to soft light. From here, we're gonna right click, add a filter, and then we're going to select the baked lighting stylized filter. This filter is going to add directional light or fake directional light onto our material and make it look like that light is bouncing off of it. It adds another layer of depth and texture and feel to the material. For this tutorial, I'm only really going to be using the sun sky drop-down menu, but I highly recommend you take as much time as possible to mess with the settings and learn exactly how this filter works. There's a lot of stuff you can do with it. So this layer is pretty much done, but I'm just messing around with all the angles and the colors to see if I can get a shot that I really like. After a bit of tweaking, I end up with something that I'm very, very happy with. Now that the texture is done, let's convert it into a smart material so we can use it on other meshes. Let's add a new folder and name it whatever you want. Then we're gonna, just like the color variation, we're going to right click everything and just drag it into the folder. Great, now that we've got everything packed into a folder, all we need to do is now right click this folder and create smart material. Then it'll automatically add this smart material to your smart material tray. And then from there, it can be basically dragged onto any other mesh, any other rock mesh, and used however you like. And it's procedural, so you can always open up the folder and tweak everything. Let's open up a new random mesh and try it out on this jade toad. So now that we have a smart material that can adjust to any rock we throw at it, let's export some of these materials and throw it in Unreal Engine and see how it looks. Like I said earlier, all of these project files are going to be available to download for free, so make sure to check the links in the description. And after a bit of work, we get something like this. Thank you so much for watching today, guys. It's been a long time since we've actually done a tutorial at Stylized Station, so it was really awesome to, get back to the roots and make something that you guys would enjoy and really learn from. You may have noticed that videos are coming out a lot slower right now, but that's only because I've started to prioritize improving my own art so I can create better things for you guys, because I really liked making tutorials in the first place, and that was kind of like, it's kind of the core of that's the core of Stylized Station. So don't worry, we'll be getting back to a lot of really cool stylized stuff in the future. So again, thanks for watching. If you make anything cool from this, feel free to share with me on Discord or email to me or whatever. I'd love to see it. Anyway, guys, I'll see you in the next video, and keep creating.